And the Steve Garvey I got to know was simply the nicest guy in the history of the world. The most willing interview I have ever encountered in all my career. He answered every question with a hint of a smile on his face and a very kindly voice. Didn't mind negative, tough questions. He was the spokesman for that team, and he handled it beautifully. He would fill your notebook answering any and every question. And to this day, the only time this has ever happened to me was the time I introduced myself in the Dodgers clubhouse for the first time to Steve Garvey. Steve immediately proceeded to interview me before I could interview him. He wanted to know everything about me. Nobody's ever done that before. No player, no coach, no baseball manager, no executive, nobody. It's always about them, and that's fine with me, but Steve wanted to know all about me. Where did you grow up? Where did you go to college? Are you married? Are you divorced? Where do you live? What neighborhood in LA do you live in? How do you like your job at the LA Times? Man, I thought I was hot stuff. I was that young gun at the LA Times, and I was living large. 5 years of age. Whew. It was something. And those Dodgers were something because they had just lost the World Series to the Yankees because they got Reggie'd. You may remember this, you longer-time baseball fans, but Game 6 became the closeout game at Yankee Stadium. And on 3 successive swings, Reggie Jackson hit 3 straight home runs that doomed the Dodgers. But now, before I proceed, I must introduce the other combatant to my story. This unfolding drama, the great Tommy Lasorda, who bled Dodger blue, who worshipped the big Dodger in the sky. Tommy was also all-time great with the media. In fact, he rivaled Steve Garvey in that department. And he rivaled Steve as the face of the franchise in those glory days in LA. The Tommy I first got to know was the third base coach under the great Walter Alston, who was then the Dodger manager, in my first couple of years here in LA working for the Times. And I wrote a lot about the Dodgers. I covered some Sunday games in place of our everyday beat writer. And guess who came to the press box every single day or night after the game? Tommy Lasorda, the third base coach. He knew how to play the game. He would come in the press box, and I would look around as I'm frantically typing my story against deadline, and Tommy would say, "You got everything you need?" Me? Well, actually, that controversial play at the plate, Tommy, what actually, let me tell you, don't quote me on this, but let me tell you exactly what happened. Oh, so that's it. Well, did I love that? Sure, I loved that. And Tommy, as he became manager, ingratiated himself at the highest level. Numerous times he came down to the LA Times to have lunch with the executives, including my sports editor, who loved me like a son, so he would invite me to those lunches with Tommy. Loved him, hearing the stories. My sports editor then invited Tommy to speak at a Sunday morning church service at his Baptist church, and I'm thinking, gee, you sure about this? Because the Tommy I knew off camera, he could F-bomb with the best of them. And by the way, if you want to get a taste of this, maybe it would drive home what I'm about to tell you even a little better. If you just go on the internet and Google for a 1982 clip, an audio clip of Tommy Lasorda responding after a game to a shot taken at him by Kurt Bavacqua of the Padres, called Tommy a fat little Italian. Trust me, listen to it, it's not too long, you will laugh at the creative use of the F-bomb and the MF bomb by Tommy Lasorda, who had a temper on him. Trust me, I'm about to show you and tell you why. So I fell into the Tommy trap just the way I fell into the Garvey trap. I love Steve. I started to think he's my friend. He even asked me and my wife at the time out for a snack one Saturday afternoon. We couldn't go, but I'm thinking, I'm living large with Steve Garvey, biggest name in baseball at that time, unless it was Reggie. And I fell into the Tommy trap because anytime I was doing a bigger piece, a magazine-length piece on an opposing baseball player, I just went straight to Tommy's office early before a game. Tommy, I'm writing about so-and-so. What can you tell me? Don't quote me on this, but let me tell you what's really going on here. And he would give me the dirt. All the gory little details that made my piece sing and dance came from Tommy Lasorda. Don't quote me on this, but you know and I know what was happening. He was buying insurance from me. I owed him. He knew I would protect him. And man, did I learn a lesson. Just before spring training in 1978, believe it or not, a school up in Central California in the little town of Lindsay decided to rename itself Steve Garvey Junior High School. And I was invited to go along with Steve and Cindy in a car driven by the Dodgers PR director named Steve Brenner, who was a friend of mine, quote unquote, to ride up. It was about a, 3-hour drive. I have no idea why we didn't fly, but we just didn't. We drove. It's hard to get to Lindsay. And I thought this would be a great time to get to know Steve and Cindy better, and I'll just go along for a great ride. Steve Brenner drove the car. Steve Garvey sat in the front passenger seat, and Cindy and I in the back seat. We'd been rolling along the highway up into Central California out of LA about an hour when Cindy turned to me and said, and I quote, "What is all this bullshit you guys write about the Dodger family?" What? Barbie said that to me? I'm like, Barbie? Where did that come from? And I mumbled something about, I'm sorry, I'm not aware of any problems in the Dodger family. Steve turns and looks at me and puts his hand over his eyes. Steve Brenner, the PR director, looks at me in the rearview mirror and rolls his eyes. And of course, being the reporter that I was, I'm all ears. And for the next hour, or might have been 2 hours, Cindy unloaded on what was going on inside the Dodger family. In her view, her eyes, she and Steve had been ostracized because she said that other players believed he was nothing but a publicity seeker. I believe she used the phrase media whore, and that Cindy promoted herself way too much doing TV interviews, and that they had been shut out because of all of the above. Nothing but resentment resounded inside the Dodger family for Ken and Barbie. I mean, I was just flat out stunned. Nobody knew anything about this. I listened. I obviously didn't take any notes. It wasn't an interview, but I took a bunch of mental notes. And Steve left the next morning for spring training way down in Vero Beach, Florida. And on Monday, I called him and I said, "Hey, you know and I know what Cindy unloaded on me. Would you talk on the record about it?" And he thought for a moment and he said, "Okay, I knew you were going to call and ask me this, and I've thought about it a lot, and I'll do it if everybody else will do it." if everybody else on the team, all the team leaders, all the other stars, and there were a bunch of them, if they all agreed to do the same interview that Steve is going to do, he's thinking maybe it would help clear the air and that he would submit to it. Remember, this team was picked once again to win the National League going into the 78 season. So I flew to Vero. I went to Steve's condo after the first game of spring training, and we sat for, I don't know, it might have been like 8 straight hours, it felt like. We went into the wee hours, and he filled several notebooks with all kinds of stories about how ostracized he and Cindy felt. It was great stuff. And the next morning, got up early, back at the park, to interview all the other stars. Some gave into it, some wouldn't. The one other player I knew the best, because I'd done a 3,000-word profile on him and spent a virtual week with him, was Ron Say, the third baseman, nicknamed the Penguin. You might or might not remember Ron. Great player. I considered Ron a friend, but as soon as I told Ron that morning what I was doing, in fact, I think he was the first one I talked to. It was him and Don Sutton, Davey Lopes, Bill Russell, Steve Yeager, all the stars, but I'm pretty sure Ron was the first, and he slipped away after we finished talking, and he went straight to Lasorda's office, and before I knew it, here came Lasorda storming out of his office, and Tommy Lasorda yelled at me, "Skip Bayless, I want to see you in my office now." And in I went. And he says, "What the hell are you doing?" "My job?" He said, "You cannot write this. It'll wreck our season. You can't do this to me." I said, "Tommy, Steve and Cindy want this out there. It's my job." And now came the fateful line. Tommy says to me, "I thought you were my friend." And I made the mistake of saying, "Well, it's not like we go to dinner, right?" That set him off. Around the desk, he came to me, and he began to sputter in my face the way he would an umpire at home plate in a rhubarb, sputtering where I'm getting spittle on my face and down my shirt. He was so angry. He had played the friendship card and saw it wasn't going to work, so he went with the intimidation card. And it was real. And he began to MF me and F me and every other word you can think of. And it got heated because I got a little heated and responded in kind, not with F-bombs, but with some anger. And Tommy Lasorda had a reputation as a minor league pitcher of being a brawler. And he often had guys in his office who appeared to have some mafia ties, and Tommy was not to be trifled with. But I trifled, and it was the closest I've ever come to exchanging blows with a subject that I was supposed to be interviewing. And we were saved only because Ron Say was trying to listen at the office door of the manager and just shoved the door open and saved us from ourselves by jumping between us. I got pushed and shoved back toward the wall, but he didn't strike me, and obviously I wasn't forced to strike back. I went straight back to my hotel room. As I recall, the Howard Johnsons in Vero Beach, not much there at that point. And I began to write. Hour in, knock on my door, it was Ron Say. Once again, he didn't use the line, but he came across as, "I thought we were friends." He didn't say that, but that was his premise and his point. How could you do this to me after all I did for you? We spent so much time together. You wrote a great story about me. You can't do this to this team. And once again, I said, Ron, I can't not write this because Steve and Cindy feel like they've been very wronged by you and all the others. And I'm going to go with it. And by God, I went with it. Never heard from Ron Say again. Never heard from Tommy Lasorda again. Talked to Steve Garvey only one more time after the story ran, and he was barely okay with it. But it hit the fan in LA. It was a bombshell. This is pre-internet. It would have hit the international internet if there had been one. And the upshot of it was, sometime in the middle of that season, because of my story and the seeds that got planted, would you believe that Steve Garvey and the best Dodger pitcher, Don Sutton, got into a fist fight in the clubhouse that spilled into Lasorda's office over all this ostracizing? Maybe that was a flashpoint for that team because they did get back to the World Series and they did get beaten by the Yankees again. But my big learns, the morals to this story, the way I do my job, I cannot be friends with any athlete, with any coach, with any manager. I can't ask any of them to be regular guests on a show, not as contributors, but as guests, doing me favors, because then I have to do them favors of protecting them when they deserve to be criticized. I'm not going to pull those punches. I'm not going to sell out. I'm going to be true to myself, and as cliched as it may come across right now, I'm going to be true to you. I do have a job to do, and I want you to trust that I'm arm's length from everybody I comment on. I protect nobody. And it's hard because I'm human, but after those near fiascos, I never became quote-unquote friends with anybody because you know what I learned? They're really not your friend. It's always an ulterior motive. They don't want to be your friend for any other reason than you make their image for them. You portray them. And they want you to portray them as a friend would portray them when they're really not your friend. Tommy Lasorda went on to win 2 World Series. Steve and Cindy went on to divorce in 1983. Steve Garvey went on to prove that he wasn't exactly the greatest guy in the world. I'll spare you the details unless you're interested. Just call up his wiki. And in the end, I believe the big Dodger in the sky was looking down, rolling his eyes at all of the above. I hope you enjoyed that video. You ready for more? Make sure you click that subscribe button for all the exclusive content from the Skip Bayless Show. And don't forget to check out the full episode of the show wherever you get your podcasts by clicking the link in the description.